Liverpool Street is one of the main commuter stations for the City of London. In the 1980s, it was redesigned and incorporated into the Broadgate complex, an extensive and prestigious property development. Broadgate typifies the entrepreneurial drive to develop rundown areas of London's old industries in the name of a multinational, service-oriented economy. The complex makes extensive use of modern art to embellish its corporate image. Yet one of the centre's key sites is dominated by this controversial sculpture, Fulcrum by Richard Serra. Its jarring contrast with the sleek finish of the surrounding architecture is obvious, and it provokes equally contrasting reactions from the commuters.
I come into the station every morning. I work very close by. And frankly, I think it's hideous.
I think it's quite nice, actually. I know a lot of my colleagues don't like it. I think it's got a sort of strength about it. I quite like the way it's going rusty as well.
Given the predictability of this mixed response to an unfamiliar type of work, the question is, what effect did the artist intend to have by installing such a work in such a place? He cannot have been ignorant of the possibility of adverse reactions, for at the very moment when Fulcrum was being erected in London in 1987, another public artwork by Richard Serra was the focus of mounting controversy in New York. Whereas Fulcrum echoes the dimensions of an essentially vertical space, Tilted Arc ran horizontally across the open space of Federal Plaza in New York City's financial and administrative district. It was installed in 1981, but from the mid-80s onwards, a campaign organised by conservative political and legal figures and claiming to draw widespread support from the public began to demand the sculpture's removal. Tilted Arc was finally dismantled by American government agencies on the night of 15th of March, 1989. Richard Serra has said of this type of sculpture that to remove such work from the site it was designed to occupy is to destroy the work. Like Tilted Arc, Fulcrum is a site-specific work. Serra has produced several of these tall, vertical pieces, but each one is adapted to the needs of its particular site, varying, for example, the height or even the number of plates. Fulcrum is made of 5 slabs of Corten steel, and the whole sculpture weighs over 200 tons. Richard Serra explains how the piece was installed.
One of the things that was really interesting about putting this piece up is that there's 5 plates, and basically the procedure is to allow these plates to lean in, and one to lean against the other as you're erecting it, and to hold them in place, and then to lean the 5th one in so that they conclude and lock in. And there's just a little slot in the ground in terms of what the underpinnings need to be. There's enough of weight below, but actually the balance of the piece and the stability of the piece occurs because of the equilibrium of the masses touching against each other. And in order to accomplish that, what we did is we stood the plates up, and then with cables, we hooked them up to the building. And then by hand, we would lower one in, and then we would lower the other one in. And then the crane finally let the 5th one come in, and we held on to it with ropes. It was one of the more exciting installations I've ever done.
There is no doubt that the scale, the unworked nature of the plates, and the rusting surface of these sculptures is problematic for many people. Serra's installation is complex and skillful, but it's not a skill normally associated with art. Likewise, rust, which conventionally signifies neglect. It's easy to overlook the fact that oxidation is a property of Corten steel, which ultimately seals and preserves it. The gradual change it involves from blue-grey to brown, from shiny to matte, is part of a wider interest in time and context, which marked off Serra's generation from previous modernist sculpture.
Probably the underlying glue that held a lot of the new work together at that time was time, the whole idea of time, that you would experience something through walking and looking, through anticipation and memory. Probably the other thing that held it together was context, that if one didn't enter into the context, so to speak, there was no work, because in order to fulfill the content of the work, there had to be a interface, both between the person's ability to experience the context and the work itself, which is very different than the autonomous object, which you can take a photograph of and place in a book. The funny thing about the autonomous object, when you really think about it, you usually think of them in rooms. Because if you take most autonomous objects and you put them out in the landscape, they fail utterly. So there was something about the notion of entering into space in a different way than the autonomous sculpture that had always occupied a pedestal. So most of this work really was involved with entering into, through, and around, which was very different than the autonomous object. You can't walk into it.
Serra was not alone in the 1960s and 70s in developing a new type of sculpture which addressed the question of its place in the world, both physically and ideologically. Just outside the town of Emmen in northern Holland is a sand and gravel quarry. Most of it is still worked, but in a disused part of the quarry, Robert Smithson, an American artist, built Broken Circle, Spiral Hill. The work was his contribution to the Sonsbeek International Festival of 1971. Like Serra, Smithson was critical of modernist notions of the autonomous art object. The other side of this was a curiosity about modern industry and what it was doing to the earth. Smithson was neither an ecologist nor did he expect art to save the world from technology. But he was interested in a form of aesthetic resistance to the technological powers which seemed to dominate the contemporary world. He made drawings for several large earthworks in mines and quarries, which he called land reclamation projects. This one was for a copper mine in America. But Broken Circle Spiral Hill is the only fully fledged example to be realised. Even so, it has changed a lot since 1971. Originally, the hill was covered in a layer of black sand from the quarry, and the spiral path around it was laid out in white sand. This contrasted with the pale yellow sand of the jetty, which cut directly into the greenish-blue water. Now the hill is dark green and brown. Its sharp outlines are blurred by cotoneaster bushes, which have been planted to stabilise it. And the spiral path is covered in wood shavings. The semicircular jetty is now separated from the water by this wooden edging intended to prevent erosion. The status of these changes is problematic, and since Smithson's early death in 1973, they have been the occasion of much controversy. On the one hand, he certainly approved limited measures to preserve the work, but at the same time, it's unlikely that he wanted the deterioration to be entirely arrested. Erosion and subsidence are continually taking place, and as such are part of the work. Smithson was interested in this return to undifferentiated matter, a process which he describes as entropy. For him, it underlined the inescapable processes of decay, which no amount of technology at a civilization's disposal can ever finally defeat. In this sense, perhaps, his earthworks can be read as a kind of vanitas, or memento mori. The inexorability of material processes, of geological time spans, which render human culture, let alone modern art, minuscule, form a continuing undercurrent in Smithson's sculpture. The choice of this quarry is particularly telling, for it only exists here at all because of the extraordinary nature of the terrain. A mixture of different sands and gravels, it is the terminal moraine of a glacier in the last ice age. Smithson's interest in the quarry marks the re-emergence of a perception which has been a leitmotif of the modern in art. A perception of the proximity of the modern and the ancient, of progress and decay. For Smithson, the machine was no more important than the earth it moved. Steel was no more important than rust. Modernist art seemed to him to be too refined, in fact too confined by its preoccupation with autonomy. For him, art had to confront the abyss which lay behind modern civilization. It had to go into places where remote futures meet remote pasts. The stone at the heart of Broken Circle Spiral Hill is a case in point. This boulder has a curious history in Smithson's work. It's been lying here ever since it was dropped by the glacier thousands of years ago. But Smithson's original idea was for the conical hill to look down on a purely flat circular jetty, so he was going to have the boulder removed. But it turned out to weigh so much that they had no equipment that was powerful enough to do this. There was even talk at one stage of involving the Dutch army, but that idea seems to have come to nothing. And anyway, as the work went on, Smithson's feelings for the stone were changing. Instead of wanting to have it taken away, he came to see it as the centre, the pivot around which everything else revolved. In his imagination, it began to take on the properties of a looming presence. He called it a glacial heart of darkness, a warning from the Ice Age. Smithson was intrigued by the boulder's similarity to other large stones which guard the entrance to the Hun's Bed, a local Bronze Age burial chamber. Time is written into the sculpture at various levels then. There is this inexorable, entropic, geological time. There is also the circular time of the seasons. And a third kind of time is involved, ours. Smithson's work, like Serra's, demands that the viewer perceive it by entering into it. We only fully experience the broken circle from the spiral hill. Conversely, we best apprehend the hill from the circle. The key thought underpinning this is that human perception and human experience are embodied. As with Serra's sculpture, we begin to experience Broken Circle Spiral Hill only as we move through it and around it. Smithson rejected modernist art with its forgetfulness of context and its requirement to imaginatively transcend all bodily and social constraint. It seemed to be in danger of defaulting on its emancipatory promise. Its failure lay in its disregard of these material factors and the idealism that involved. Smithson believed it was better to disclose the reality of confinement than to peddle illusions of freedom. Smithson and Serra were, of course, independent artists. Nonetheless, they were involved in a common cause, challenging modernist sculptural conventions. This is the Kroller-Muller Sculpture Park, also in Holland. Serra installed a site-specific work here in 1973. Serra called this work Spin Out, and he subtitled it For Robert Smithson, who had been killed in a plane crash a few months earlier. Clearly, though, it isn't a monument in any conventional sense. It doesn't depict him or anything like that. So beyond that mere fact of the title, is there any connection that we can make between this piece and Smithson's own outdoor work, such as the Broken Circle? Let's look first in more detail at Spin Out itself. Whereas Smithson tended to work with the materials of a particular site, Serra has obviously imported his material, Corten steel again. But once more, there is an emphasis on the specifics of place not to be found in conventional modernist sculpture. The 3 steel plates are set into the sides of an elliptical valley. Each plate is 10 feet high and 40 feet long. The triangular space implied by the ends of the plates is 152 feet on its long side and 78 feet on each shorter one. That's the geometry. But as one moves through the glade, all these angles, sizes and dimensions seem to change with the spectator's point of view. Shifting and surprisingly dynamic relationships are set up between the pieces of metal and the spaces and the gradients of the glade they occupy. As with Smithson's work, the experience of moving through the piece, of viewing it from different angles and heights in relation to the locomotion of one's own body, is central. This is unlike previous modernist sculpture, where all the dimensions, the angles, the metal itself were transmuted into the imaginative world of the artwork. Here the artwork is in our world, a physical thing and a set of relationships between physical things, of which our experience is palpably embodied. And what of the material itself? Spin-out is made of Corten steel, like Fulcrum, although this is a slightly thinner plate. And because it's been exposed to the air for so much longer, this relatively shiny slate-coloured skin that Corten steel has when it's new, and which is still clearly visible on Fulcrum, has here almost completely oxidised away to leave this heavy, matte, brown surface. However, neither the texture nor the colour is uniform throughout. The weathering process is still taking place, and according to the prevailing wind and the action of sunlight and rain, different faces reveal widely different aspects. The effect of climatic conditions upon the work is nowhere more evident than in the lichens which have in places grown on the steel, and in the thick green deposits down below. At different times of the year, the play of light falling through the leaves can almost dissolve the huge steel blades. Thus, the character of the work is continually being reformed in the dialectic of the steel and its site. As Serra says,
the landscape pieces tend to be more about anticipation, memory, reverie, maybe more lyrical in some sense. They may even be the most abstract aspect of my work, I don't know.
Can we notice any formal similarities between Serra's spin-out and Smithson's broken circle spiral hill?
I didn't think specifically of Smithson when I was doing the piece in the Kroller-Muller. I was trying to extend how I wanted to deal with steel in the landscape in relation to my own work. But for me to say that I wasn't influenced early on by Bob Smithson is a complete falsehood. I mean, I was absolutely close to him in a way where I couldn't help but be influenced by him. And after he died, there was a point where I thought about him every day.
Perhaps it's worth recognising a very basic point about the terrains that both Serra and Smithson have used. Although the glade here is natural, whereas the quarry is man-made, both offer more of a possibility of overview, of contrasting plans and elevations, than is common in an overwhelmingly flat country like Holland. In Smithson's work, the broken circle tends to read clockwise, and the suggested motion can be seen as centrifugal, outwards from the stone. The path to the top of the hill, on the other hand, spirals inwards in a contracting centripetal motion. It's significant that Serra has observed of his own piece that when it's viewed from ground level as one enters the glade, the effect is of a movement outwards by the plates. Yet, when viewed from above, the effect is one of contraction, of movement inwards towards the centre. Both Broken Circle, Spiral Hill and Spin Out have had a positive public reception. The owners of the quarry, the de Boer family, and the local arts administrators have preserved Smithson's unique work at Emmen. And here too at Kroller-Muller, Serra's sculpture arouses interested discussion as well as more solitary exploration. Yet the insertion of site-specific work into urban public spaces, as we've already seen, has been a more controversial issue. Rusting steel and geometric shapes can appear picturesque in the countryside, but in the city, features beyond the merely physical and perceptual come inescapably onto the agenda. People's conventional expectations of public art and the nature of their environment are brought to the fore. The political and economic interests structuring that environment are also forced into consideration. To the extent that these works engage with power, they tread a dangerous line. A line between alerting people to the norms, values and mechanisms of power in which their lives are enmeshed, and that of becoming one more aspect of that power. Serra is in no doubt about the stakes involved. His urban, site-specific sculptures are not meant to sit comfortably in their locations. They are meant to pose a challenge to them, to the conventions of the architecture, and not least to the ideologies that sustain what goes on inside that architecture.
I'm not a big fan of this architecture, and I actually think that my work, in some sense, exposes the facade of a lot of the architecture. On the other hand, in urban environments, you can't help but expose, to some degree, what's there. There's always an ideological overtone of the frame, and you always have to contend with it, and you can't escape it. I think often what happens is work has to resist the maelstrom of storm or whatever to take place in the context. Children growing up with work immediately understand, oh, that's the sculpture that I grew up with. They have no problem with it. Older people who think that they know something about what conventions ought to be can be thoughtlessly critical. But I think one of the things that's interesting about art is that it gives you an experience that nothing else can in a diversity of ways, and you can continually go back to it to understand your own relation to the world. As small as that sounds, or as insignificant as it sounds, we don't have much else. There's not much else that gives us the ability to grow in the way that art does.